The first thing Vara remembered about Senna was her hands. Not the color of her eyes, not the sound of her laugh, not the careful precision of her footsteps on the stone floors of the iron hold. It was the hands. Small, quick, brown-knuckled things that were always moving, always building, always taking something apart to see how it breathed. Senna had been 8 years old and already halfway up a war engine scaffold when Vara's father dragged her down by the collar and presented her to his daughter like a gift. "She fixed the pulley system in the armory," he said. "Couldn't sleep until she did. I think she'll keep you out of trouble." Senna had not kept anyone out of trouble in the 40 years since. The iron hold sat at the edge of the Greyvest Plateau, a fortress cut directly from the black granite of the mountain, built by Vara's grandfather in an age when the clans still warred with one another rather than with the things that came from the sky. The walls were old enough to have their own names. The courtyard stones were worn so smooth by generations of boots that they caught light like water. Vara had grown up on those stones, had scraped her knees on them, had learned to throw a knife against the eastern wall until the knife stopped trembling in her grip. She knew every crack in every wall, every draft that moved through the corridors in winter, every guard who snored on watch. She had become its queen when she was 19, the day the Keth came down. The Keth did not announce themselves. They did not send scouts or envoys or the slow gray precursors that the elder texts sometimes described before alien arrivals. They simply appeared above the plateau at dawn, 6 shapes against a green-tinged sky, their ships the color of something the eye refused to hold, a shade between silver and wound, between light and the absence of it. The people of the Ironhold had stood in the courtyard and stared up with their mouths open. Vara's father had turned to his general and said, very quietly, that he was afraid. He had died 4 hours later when the first harvester drone swept the ridge. Vara had burned his body that night because the Keth did not leave them time to grieve properly. She had been queen since then, 21 years. Long enough that the weight of it had ceased to feel like a weight and had become simply the shape of her spine, the angle at which she held her shoulders, the way her voice dropped half a register when she spoke to frighten people so they would hear steadiness before they heard words. She was not the largest of her kind. The Orc clans of the plateau ran tall and broad, and Vara was neither, though her arms were ropey, and her jaw was set in a way that made new advisors choose their words carefully. What she had instead of size was patience. A very specific kind of patience that Senna had once described as the patience of someone who has already decided what they're going to do and is simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. That had been on a night when they were still calling each other friend without qualification, before the tunnels, before the arrangement, before the morning 3 weeks ago when Vara had read the transcript of the conversation Senna had been having with the Keth's ground liaison, and something cold and precise had moved through her chest like a blade finding the seam between ribs. She sat now at the long stone table in the War Council chamber, 7 of her captains ranged around her, the maps spread between them lit by blue fire torches that cast no shadows worth mentioning. She kept her hands flat on the table. She had learned over 21 years that her hands communicated her feelings before her face did, and her face had already been schooled into something unreadable. "The northern relay is down," said Darrow, her eldest captain, a man with the face of someone who had been hit with the same thing enough times it no longer left a mark. The Keth drone that took it out was operating outside its surveilled quadrant. They're pushing boundaries. "They're testing the response window," Vara said. "How long between the relay going dark and us noticing?" 11 minutes. "They'll remember that." "My queen." This was Pren, youngest of the captains, her voice careful in the particular way of someone delivering bad news. "There's a more immediate problem. The eastern supply route, the one we've been calling Route 17, it's been compromised. The passage is sealed. Someone gave the Keth the coordinates." Nobody moved. The torches moved. Vara watched the blue light shift across the maps. "How many knew that route?" she said. Pren's eyes moved very briefly to the doorway behind Vara. 7 people, within these walls. Vara said, "Get me the names." She already had them. She had had them for 3 weeks. She had read them in the transcript, mapped them against the known contacts, measured the timeline of information leaks against the movements of the only person in the Ironhold with unrestricted access to every quadrant, every route, every relay position. The math was not complicated. The math had never been complicated. That was not the difficulty. The difficulty was that Vara had woken up this woman every morning for 32 years whenever the night terrors came. The difficulty was that she had sat beside this woman in the dark of the Keth's first bombardment, with their hands knotted together so tightly that Vara's fingers had bruised. The difficulty was that Senna had once cut her own palm and pressed it to Vara's cut palm on the high ridge at sunset when they were 12 years old, and had said in a voice shaking with the solemnity only children can sustain, "I swear it, whatever comes." Whatever comes. She dismissed the captains. She sat alone in the chamber for a while. Then she rose, straightened her coat, and walked to the engineer's wing. Senna's workshop was the only room in the Ironhold that Vara had never given orders to clean. It had evolved over 40 years into a kind of ecosystem. Coils of copper wire nested between ceramic insulators, old blueprints layered over older blueprints until the table looked geological, tools ranked with obsessive precision along one wall, while everything else existed in chaos that Senna alone could navigate. It smelled of solder and machine oil, and the particular mineral sharpness of Keth components that had been disassembled and studied, and partially rebuilt into things the Keth had never intended. Senna was at the far bench. Her back was to the door. She was working on something small, hunched forward in the posture Vara had watched her take 1,000 times, her gray-streaked hair pulled back, her fingers moving with that old remembered sureness. She said without turning, "I wondered how long." Vara stepped inside and shut the door. "Since when?" Vara asked. Senna set down her tool. She turned. Her face was older than Vara's because the night terrors had never let her sleep properly, and insomnia carved people differently. Her eyes were the color of dark water and they were dry. She had clearly been expecting this and had prepared her face for it. 14 months, she said. You've been feeding them coordinates for 14 months. I've been feeding them coordinates they already had mostly. Routes that were going to be discovered, supplying them with nothing they couldn't find themselves in a quarter's time. Senna's voice was not defensive. It was the voice of someone who had rehearsed an argument until it felt like truth. In exchange for them agreeing not to advance the processing schedule on the Southern Valley, 40,000 people, Vara. The Keth were going to begin extraction there last spring. They delayed a full year. For a year, Vara said. For a year, 40,000 people are alive who otherwise wouldn't be. The room was quiet. Somewhere in the fortress, someone was drilling in the courtyard, the rhythm of it coming up through the stone floor in a faint tremor. And Route 17, Vara said, the supply route. The one we used to move the wounded from the last 3 engagements. Senna looked at the floor just for a moment, then her eyes came back up. I didn't give them 17. Then who did? The Keth have other sources. I told you that in the transit report 2 months ago. I told you your inner circle had a second breach. You told me there was a breach, Vara said. You were very careful not to tell me you knew this because you were already in contact with them. The silence stretched long enough to become its own kind of answer. Vara crossed the room, not quickly. She sat on the stool beside the smaller workbench, the one where Senna had taught her to solder when they were teenagers, and she put her elbows on her knees, and she looked at the woman she had known for 40 years, and she tried to find somewhere inside herself where the arithmetic of it resolved cleanly into something she could act on. It didn't resolve cleanly. It didn't resolve at all. What it did was sit in her chest like a stone with 2 equal sides. Tell me what they offered you, she said. Something moved in Senna's face. Not guilt, it was past guilt, worn smooth by months of living with the decision, but something sadder and less forgivable. Relief. The relief of someone who had been carrying a secret so long that even being caught felt like setting down a weight. "They didn't offer me anything," Senna said. "I went to them." Vara said nothing. "I spent 11 months studying the Keth's behavioral patterns, the processing schedules, the resource prioritization algorithms they use to decide where to advance and where to hold. And I found, Vara, listen to me, I found a margin, a negotiating space. They are not ideologically committed to our extinction. They are resource optimizers. They process what is efficient to process, and they avoid costs that exceed projected yield. If you give them a believable yield shortfall in a given sector, they reallocate. They actually reallocate." Senna leaned forward, her hands on her knees, her voice finding the energy it always found when she was explaining a mechanism she'd discovered. "They are not our enemies. They are a process, and processes can be redirected. By giving them our roots. By giving them outdated roots. By feeding them a picture of our capabilities that makes advancing on us a net loss calculation. You made this decision alone. I tried to bring it to you twice. Do you remember the engineering briefings in the 4th month of last year? The ones about Keth behavioral modeling?" Vara remembered them. She had been managing the aftermath of the Western Siege simultaneously and had sent Pren as her proxy. "You sent Pren," Senna said. "Not an accusation, just the fact of it offered plainly." Vara sat with that. She had a choice to make, and she knew it. And the particular difficulty was that both choices were wrong in ways she could see clearly and would still have to live with. She could arrest Senna, try her for collaboration with the enemy, execute the judgment that the law of the Ironhold required, and she would lose the only mind in the fortress that had found a crack in the Keth's resource calculation, the only living person who had successfully negotiated even a temporary stay of processing from a species that did not negotiate. She could release her, expel her, exile her to the southern clans with nothing, and the Keth would know within days because they would be watching for Senna's signals to stop, and whatever stay of processing had been earned would end. Or she could do the thing she had been turning over in her mind for 3 weeks, since the night she had read the transcript and then sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a very long time. "What are the specific variables," she said, "that make us a net loss calculation?" Senna went still. "Not in theory," Vara said. "In numbers. What does it take? What has to be true of our apparent strength, our apparent mobility, our apparent resource base, for the Keth's algorithm to look at the plateau and decide the cost of full processing exceeds projected yield?" Senna stared at her. Then slowly, she reached beneath the work table and pulled out a battered notebook filled edge to edge with calculations in her small, precise script. "I've been working on exactly that," she said. "I know," said Vara. "I had someone read your workshop notes." The silence now was different. It was the silence of two people discovering they had been thinking the same thought from opposite sides of the same wall. "You knew," Senna said. "For how long?" 3 weeks. "And you didn't." "I needed to know," Vara said, "whether your math was right." Another silence. The drilling in the courtyard went on its patient rhythm. "Is it?" Vara asked. Senna opened the notebook to a page dense with figures. "There's an 83% probability window," she said. "If we can sustain the illusion for 8 months, we present a unified plateau with intact infrastructure, ongoing military viability, resource extraction that makes our territory a negative yield proposition. We need 4 things." She held up 4 fingers, and the old habit of counting arguments on her fingers was so familiar that it opened a crack in Vara's chest that she refused to acknowledge. "First, we need to feed their surveilling drones a picture of manufacturing capacity we don't actually have. I've been working on false heat signatures, The drones read thermal output to estimate productive capacity, and I can fake the signature of 12 operational forges with 6 physical heat sources and reflective. Show me the design. Senna blinked. Now. Now, Vara said. And then you're going to tell me the second thing, and the third, and the fourth, and then you're going to tell me which of it you've already built and which of it needs resources you don't have, and then you're going to tell me what you need from me to finish it. Vara, Senna's voice had gone unsteady for the first time. What I did. What you did, Vara said carefully, was make a unilateral decision in the dark about the lives of everyone in this fortress and on this plateau, and you were probably right about the immediate outcome, and you were definitely wrong about the method. And we are going to have a complete and thorough conversation about that, you and I, and it is going to be one of the worst conversations we have ever had. She looked directly at Senna. And then we are going to build your machine. Senna pressed her hands over her mouth. Her shoulders moved once. Her eyes stayed dry, which was the Senna that Vara had always known. She did not cry. She simply absorbed, and you could tell something had landed by the way she became briefly motionless, like a struck bell. Show me the heat signature design, Vara said again, and her voice was the voice she used in council, the voice with the weight of the plateau behind it. But Senna had known her for 40 years and heard everything else in it too, and that was the gift and the grief of being known. The notebook opened. The calculations began. They worked through the night, the two of them, the way they had worked through 100 nights before this one, bent over the same surface, Senna explaining and Vara asking the hard questions that restructured the explanation, both of them building towards something that was more than either of them had arrived with. Around the third hour, Senna's assistant brought food and left without being asked. Around the fifth hour, Vara took off her command coat and folded it over the spare stool because the workshop was warm and the night was long. At some point before dawn, Senna looked up from the schematic and said, "Why mercy?" Vara didn't look up from the calculations. "I'm sorry. You could have executed me, legally correctly with full justification. You could have used my notes and continued the deception without me. You have people who could implement the technical details with enough guidance." Senna's voice was quiet, not hopeful, just honest in the way she was always honest when she was too tired to be anything else. So why? Vara set down her pen. She looked at the wall for a moment, at the old blueprints layered like years, at the tools ranked with that obsessive precision, at the small, careful record of a mind that had spent 40 years making the impossible workable. Because hatred, she said slowly, is the worst kind of bad engineering. It burns fuel to no productive end. It generates heat without work. She picked up the pen again. And because you were right about the yield calculation. And I need the person who was right about that. That's very pragmatic. Yes. A pause, the kind of pause that had a shape to it. Vara. Don't, Vara said. We'll have the conversation, we'll have the whole conversation, but not tonight. Senna nodded. She turned back to the schematic. Her hands moved with that old sureness, building the thing that might, if the math held, keep 40,000 people alive. Before the false heat generators, there were 3 days of arguments. Vara had expected arguments. She had not expected them to come from Darrow. He found her in the map room on the second evening, after the captains had retired, and the fortress had gone to its watchful nighttime quiet. He came in without announcement, which he had not done in 11 years, which told her before he said a word that this was not a captain reporting to his queen. "Tell me you haven't forgiven her," he said. Vara was rolling up the eastern quadrant map. She did not stop. "I've made a command decision about how to handle an asset." An asset. He said the word the way you said a word that had been used to cover up another word. She gave the Keth our roots. Outdated roots, with the intent of. I know what her intent was. I read the same transcript you did. He moved to the other side of the table. He was a large man, and he occupied space with the particular efficiency of someone who had spent decades learning to waste nothing. "My queen, I have served you since your father died. I was at the gate when you came out into the courtyard at 19 years old with blood on your sleeve, and took command of a fortress full of people who were certain we were going to die. I would follow you into anything you put in front of me." He paused. "I am asking you to tell me you know the difference between mercy and blindness." Vara set down the map. She looked at him. "She went to the Keth," he said, "alone, without telling you. She made a negotiation on behalf of this fortress and everyone in it, and she never gave us the chance to say no." "Yes," Vara said. "You would have said no." Vara thought about this with the honesty it deserved. "Probably." "Then she knew that. She made the decision for you." "For all of us." "Yes." "And you're rewarding that." "I'm using it," Vara said. "There is a difference, and I need you to hold on to that difference because it matters. I'm not telling you what Senna did was right. I am telling you that the thing she found, the crack in the Keth's resource calculation, is the best strategic asset this fortress has ever had, and I am not going to destroy it because I'm angry." She picked up the map again. "I am angry, Darrow. I have been angry for 3 weeks, and I will be angry for some time to come. But I am the queen of this plateau, and I do not get the luxury of making decisions based on what I feel." Darrow stood with that for a while. His face went through several things. "The others will see it as permission," he said finally. "If she faces no consequences." "She faces consequences," Vara said. "She faces my full knowledge of what she did, and the obligation to prove that the thing she built was worth the cost of how she built it. And she faces having to work alongside Kren on Route 3, which, if you know either of them, is its own considerable punishment." She set the map aside. "What you're asking me to do is execute someone who probably saved 40,000 lives because she did it wrong. I can't give you that, Darrow. The math doesn't hold." He looked at her for a long time. In the quiet, somewhere in the fortress, a sentry changed posts, footsteps echoing up through the stone. "Your father," he said, "would have had her head." "My father," Vara said, with the particular kind of love that could hold grief and critique in the same breath, "died 4 hours into the Keth's first engagement because he couldn't recalibrate fast enough. He was a better man than I will ever be. He was also built for a world that ended 21 years ago." She looked at the maps. "I'm trying to build us for the world that's actually here." Darrow said nothing more. He straightened, and the straightening had the quality of a decision settling, not a resignation. He turned and left the room. In the hallway, just before his footsteps faded, he paused. "If she does it again," he said through the open doorway, "I'll be less philosophical." "If she does it again," Vara said, "so will I." The false heat generators took 11 days to build and 6 days to position. Senna supervised both operations from a wheeled cart because she'd wrenched her back in the second installation and refused to stop working, and Vara had watched her being moved from station to station with the expression of someone who had decided not to say anything and was paying the cost of that decision in silence. The drones swept the plateau on the 14th day. Vara stood in the old signal tower with Darrow and Pren and watched the Kethcraft pass overhead. Long, articulated things, their undersides studded with sensor arrays that were reading heat and mass and electromagnetic output, and whatever else the Keth's instruments could parse from altitude. They passed without slowing. They passed without any indication that the picture they were receiving was anything other than what they expected to find. "They bought it," Pren said. "They processed it," Vara corrected. "There's a difference." The second element of Senna's plan was harder. It required convincing the Keth's ground liaison, a creature they called the intermediary, who communicated through a translated audio device at war against what might have been a throat, that the plateau clans had consolidated under unified command and had access to resource stockpiles that made their extraction cost-prohibitive. This required Vara to enter into a direct communication with the Keth, which was a thing she had spent 21 years refusing to do on the grounds that the Keth's communications were themselves a form of survey, a way of reading your strength by hearing what you asked for and what you withheld. She did it anyway, because Senna's math said it was necessary, and because the alternative was to let the silence between them keep standing in for everything she couldn't yet say. The intermediary communicated through the device in a voice that was technically human but wrong in ways that were hard to name. The pitch varied in directions that pitch didn't normally vary. The pauses came in places that were grammatically correct but emotionally sideways, and the intermediary itself sat across the communication array with a physical stillness that was not the stillness of discipline, but the stillness of something that did not experience discomfort as a reason to move. Vara had faced worse. She had sat in rooms with dying people and had to find a voice that could hold steady. She sat in the signal chamber with her hands folded and spoke to the intermediary for 43 minutes, and at no point did her voice do anything she hadn't decided it should do. Afterwards, standing in the corridor with Senna and Darrow, she said, "Did it land?" Senna had been monitoring the Keth sensor output during the conversation. She checked the readings on the small device she'd built for that purpose. Their survey drones shifted pattern 17 minutes into the call. They began scanning the western approach, which is where you told them the bulk of our consolidated force was stationed. She looked up. They moved toward the false picture. They accepted it. Darrow let out a breath. He was not a man given to expressions of relief, which made his expressions of relief memorable. "Third element," Vara said. Third was infrastructure. The plateau had 3 supply corridors, and the Keth had compromised 2, Route 17 from the internal breach Senna had warned about, and Route 8 from 2 years of incremental surveilling. What remained was Route 3, which ran through a passage in the rock so narrow that it had never been worth mapping officially, and which Senna had marked in her own notebook 6 months ago as the last viable artery. It needed to be made to look like more than an artery. It needed to look like a main road, heavily defended, extensively used, the kind of supply line that spoke to the scale of the unified command Vara had described to the intermediary. This was the element that required the most people to know the plan: engineers, scouts, supply teams, the captains. And with more people came more risk of the second breach that Senna had identified but not yet named. She named it at the 4th-week briefing, with all 7 captains present, and the maps spread on the table and the blue fire torches throwing their shadowless light across everyone's faces. "Kren," she said. Nobody moved for a moment. Then 6 pairs of eyes went to the captain at the far end of the table, and Kren, a broad-shouldered man who had served the Ironhold for 18 years, who had been at Vara's left hand for 3 sieges, who had once carried a wounded soldier 4 miles through Keth-held territory on his own back, looked at Senna and did not say anything at all. "The contact was established before Route 17, Senna said. She was speaking to Vara, but she was watching Kren, probably through the transit point near the southern pass. The Keth's secondary ground teams maintain human assets for exactly this purpose. They offer personal exemptions, safety of family members, medical technology. The things that people will do almost anything for when they're frightened enough." Kren said, "My son was processing scheduled." "I know," Senna said. "He's 11 years old." "I know," Vara said. The room was very quiet. The drilling in the courtyard had stopped. The torches moved. "Did you get what you needed," Vara said, "for your son?" Kren looked at her. Something was happening in his face that the discipline of 18 years was struggling to contain. "The schedule was lifted 3 months ago. And you've continued feeding them information since then." He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Vara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about a stone with 2 equal sides. She thought about yield calculations and the cost of hatred. She thought about Senna working through the night in the workshop, hands moving with their old sureness, building something that might save the plateau because she had loved it enough to do a wrong thing in its service. "Your son," she said, "what's his name?" Kren blinked. "Tavrik." "Tavrik?" She said the name once, giving it its proper weight. "You will be removed from the council. You will not be executed. You will be stationed at the Route 3 development until further notice, where you will work under Engineer Senna's direct oversight, and you will apply the same capabilities that made you valuable to the Keth to making the false road as convincing as anything you've ever built." She paused. "Because you are very good at making things look like what they're not. And we need that right now." The silence that followed was the kind that had several different emotions moving through it simultaneously, the way a river runs over complicated ground. Darrow said, very quietly, "My queen." Vara looked at him. "Nothing," he said, and he meant it, not nothing as dismissal, but nothing as the particular affirmation of someone who has seen their leader do something they did not expect and have decided the unexpected thing was right. The fourth element was the one that kept Vara awake on the nights when the others didn't. It was the thing that Senna had named in the notebook as the commitment signal, the piece of the yield calculation that the Keth's algorithm required to be satisfied before it would move the plateau from the active processing queue to the held queue. Reducing cost was not enough. There had to be a positive demonstration that the cost would continue to increase, that the plateau was not merely difficult now but would become more difficult over time, that processing it was a long-term negative yield proposition. The Keth did not respect strength in the way that enemies traditionally respected strength. They had not evolved for respect, as far as Senna could determine. What they responded to was a specific data signature that their algorithms interpreted as sustained yield decline, a pattern that indicated an adversary that would cost more to overcome with each successive engagement. In humans, this correlated loosely with what a human observer might call the refusal to break. Not aggression, not defiance. The steady, undramatic, computational fact of continued existence in the face of everything the Keth had applied to end it. "We have that," Vara said, the night Senna explained the fourth element. "We need to demonstrate it in a format their drones can record," Senna said. "An active engagement, in the right quadrant with the right energy signature from our side at the right duration. A battle. A very specifically calibrated battle. Which is, admittedly, the hardest kind to plan." They planned it for 2 weeks. It happened on a cold, clear morning with the kind of sky that looked painted, high and blue and indifferent. The plateau spread below it in all its old, worn beauty, the black granite walls of the iron hold catching the first light in the way they always had. Vara stood on the eastern ridge with 200 of her people and watched the Keth's reconnaissance craft approach from the south, and she thought, not for the first time, about her father's face turned up toward the green-tinged sky 21 years ago. About the way he had said he was afraid, quietly, without embarrassment, because the Ironhold had always been a place where fear could be named without shame. She was afraid now. That was appropriate. The fear was information. She used it. The night before the engagement, Vara walked the walls alone. She had done this since she was 19, not as inspection, though she always noticed what needed noticing, but as a way of resetting herself before something large. There was something about moving through the fortress in the dark, feeling the stone beneath her boots, hearing the sentries at their posts, that made the abstract concrete and the concrete bearable. The Ironhold was a real place. These were real walls built by real hands. Whatever was going to happen tomorrow, it was going to happen here, in a place that had stood for 3 generations, and that she was not going to let end on her watch. She passed the armory, which had lights burning late, the night crew checking equipment, a habit they'd maintained through all 21 years because Vara had made it a rule in the 2nd month after the Keth came, and never rescinded it. She passed the grain stores and the water reservoir, both marked now with Senna's false signature emitters, Small, unremarkable devices bolted to the walls that hummed at a frequency below hearing and broadcast a lie to the sky. She passed the infirmary, which was quiet tonight, which was a gift. She stopped at the western watchtower. Not because anything required her attention there, but because the western view of the plateau was the one she loved best. The way the land fell away toward the valley, the faint lights of the settlements visible in the clear dark, the absolute black of the sky above with its unfamiliar stars that had been unfamiliar since the Keth's fleet first hung there, and changed the way the night looked. A step on the stone behind her, she did not turn. "You should be sleeping," she said. "You should be sleeping," Senna said. They stood at the watchtower parapet. The wind moved across the plateau, carrying the smell of cold rock and the far-off mineral sharpness that had become, over 21 years, the smell of the Keth's machinery even when none was visible. "Tell me what you're afraid of," Senna said, not as a challenge, as the question she always asked before the hard things, the one that had been their private ritual since they were children in the workshop, because Senna had always believed that you couldn't solve a problem you hadn't named. Vara looked at the valley lights. "That the engagement calculation is wrong," she said. "That we hold for 91 minutes and take the losses and the drones record everything, and the algorithm still moves us further up the processing queue instead of down. The margin of error in the model is—" "I know the margin of error. I'm telling you what I'm afraid of." Senna was quiet for a moment. "What else?" "That we're teaching them," Vara said. "Every time we run a deception, we're showing them our deception methods. They're learning us the way they learn everything, by observation and algorithm. At some point, the model gets sophisticated enough that the false signals don't work anymore because they've mapped our signature well enough to identify the difference between a real forge and a false heat emitter." "That's a real concern," Senna said. "It's in the 3rd section of the notebook. The deception has a shelf life, which is why," she stopped. "Which is why what?" Senna turned to face the valley. Her profile was sharp in the dark, the same profile Vara had been seeing for 40 years, now older and more complicated in the way that faces got when they'd held difficult things for a long time. "Which is why the 8th month target isn't the end. It's the beginning of the next problem. If we get to held queue status, we need to use that time to build something real, not false signatures and calibrated engagements, actual manufacturing capacity, actual consolidated command, actual resource base." She paused. "We need to become, over time, the thing we've been pretending to be." Vara turned to look at her. "That will take years." "Yes. We may not have years. We may not, or we may have exactly enough." Senna's voice was steady. "The Keth are a long-term process. We have to be a longer-term process. That's the actual competition." The wind moved. Below them, the valley lights held their positions in the dark, small and steady. "40 years ago," Vara said, "I watched a girl climb a scaffold she had no business being on and fix a pulley system that 3 adult engineers had given up on. My father said she couldn't sleep until she did." She looked at Senna. "You still can't sleep until the thing is fixed." Senna's mouth moved into something that wasn't quite a smile but contained one. "Some things don't change." "No," Vara said, "they don't." She turned from the parapet. "Get some sleep. We need the heat signature emitters at full output before dawn." "They're already running." "Of course they are." Vara walked toward the tower stairs. "Get some sleep anyway." "Vara." She stopped. Senna said, "Whatever happens tomorrow, what you've done here, the decision you made, I want you to know I understand the cost of it." Vara stood on the stair with her hand on the cold stone wall. She thought about what to say and then didn't say it, because it was the kind of thing that needed to be said in daylight, with time around it, and not in the last hours before an engagement that might take people she loved. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," Senna agreed. The cold, clear morning came, and with it the painted sky, and Vara walked out to the eastern ridge to meet it. They did not win, winning was not the point. They held their position against a force that outmatched them in every material category, and they held it with the specific quality of endurance that Senna's calculations said the Keth's drones would read as sustained yield decline from their adversary's perspective. They absorbed what they absorbed. They did not break. They did not run. At the end of 91 minutes, the Keth force pulled back, not defeated, recalculating, and the drones swept the ridge twice, recording everything. Vara had 7 dead and 11 wounded. The engagement lasted 91 minutes. In the first 20 minutes, the Keth advanced from the south as predicted, 3 ground units and 1 aerial support craft, which Senna had designated a standard reconnaissance in force. They were not trying to overrun the ridge. They were probing for the response pattern, the recovery time, the upper limit of sustainable resistance. The Keth always probed. They were extraordinarily patient. It was the thing about them that most resembled what Vara had learned to call the human quality of thoroughness, except that human thoroughness was usually accompanied by some variety of emotion, and the Keth seemed genuinely unburdened by any need to feel anything about the process of accumulating data. She had explained this to her people in the briefing the night before last. Not to dehumanize the enemy. She had long since stopped using that word for the Keth, because dehumanizing something was a way of not thinking about it clearly, and she needed to think about the Keth more clearly than she had ever thought about anything. She explained it because she needed her 200 fighters to understand what they were doing on that ridge. They were not fighting to win. They were performing, with their bodies and their blood and their genuine resistance, a very precise demonstration for an audience of drones. They had to hold. They had to hold at exactly the sustained yield threshold, and they had to do it while people were dying, because people would die, because actual engagement with the Keth produced actual casualties, and there was no clean version of this. Varrett had said from the second row, "So we're data." "You are the thing that makes the data true," Vara had said. "There's a difference." She thought about Varrett at the 30-minute mark, when the aerial support craft began a strafing pattern along the northern edge of the ridge. She thought about her when the second volley landed and the northern section collapsed inward, and Vara heard, above the noise of the engagement, a sound she had been hearing for 21 years and never stopped flinching from. She did not look. She could not look and keep the center line. She held the center line. What she could do and did was count. Her mind had learned to count in combat the way some minds learn to calculate angles or read wind, automatically, outside of the part of the brain that was managing everything else. She counted footsteps, and she counted voices, and she counted, without wanting to, the number of voices that went quiet at intervals that told her they weren't repositioning. At 68 minutes, the Keth began to pull back, not because they were losing, because they had collected their data and their calculus was complete and continuing cost more than it returned. They pulled back with the same indifferent efficiency with which they had advanced, the aerial craft ascending, the ground units withdrawing in their unhurried geometric patterns. She held the ridge for another 23 minutes, because Senna had said 91 and Senna's math had gotten them this far, and she was not going to undershoot the number because 68 minutes had already cost more than she had wanted to spend. 7 dead, 11 wounded. She walked the line herself after the way she had been doing for 21 years, not quickly, not with the brisk efficiency of a commander tallying resources, but slowly, because these were people and she owed them slowness. She knew 5 of the 7 by name and knew them well, and she looked at each of them for a moment that was not long enough and would never be long enough, and she held the number in her chest where it would stay. The names were Varrett and Kames, and young Drac, who had joined the garrison 6 months ago and had not stopped talking about his sister's new child in the eastern settlement, and priest-soldier Mena, who had ministered to the dying at the western siege 3 years ago, and Pharaoh, who was the best knife fighter in the iron hold, and had once beaten Vara in a fair match and grinned about it for a week, and 2 others whose names were on her lips before she could stop them. Henat and Bayer, who had served together for 12 years and who, she had quietly suspected, had been serving each other's hearts as well. She carried the 7, she had always carried them. She had a particular place inside her chest where the dead went, and it had been getting more crowded for 21 years, and she had no interest in making more room there than was absolutely necessary. The work was to make sure the space didn't grow faster than it had to. That was the whole of it. That was the entire mathematics of leadership in a war you hadn't started, to spend as little as possible of what you couldn't replace, and to make every expenditure mean something, and to remember every name. She spent that evening in the infirmary. Not the commanding presence showing solidarity kind of visiting that she had learned to do over 21 years, but the sitting down and staying kind, because she was tired, and because the dead had names, and because the Ironhold had always been a place where you did not pretend those two things were separable. Senna found her there near midnight, when the badly wounded were sleeping and the lightly wounded were quiet. She sat on the floor beside Vara's chair because there was nowhere else to sit, and she had never been precious about floors. They sat for a while without talking. "The drone data transmitted to the fleet relay," Senna said eventually. "I picked up the burst transmission. They sent the full engagement record." Vara nodded. "The algorithm will take 4 to 6 weeks to run the updated calculation. I won't know the outcome until—" "I know," Vara said. Another silence. "The conversation," Senna said. Vara looked at her. "You said we would have it." Senna's voice was careful, but her hands, those quick, small, brown-knuckled hands, were still for the first time Vara could remember. "You said it would be one of the worst we'd had. I've been waiting." "Have you?" "Yes." A pause. "Are you going to tell me I was wrong?" Vara considered the question seriously. The way she considered all serious questions, turned it over, looked at its underside, measured it against what she actually believed rather than what was convenient to believe. "You were wrong about the method," she said. "Everything you did alone you should have done with me, not because I'm your queen, because I'm your partner in this, and you knew that and you chose the dark anyway." She looked at the wall. "You were right that I was distracted. You were right that I sent Pren to the briefings. That is also a thing we will have to reckon with." She looked back at Senna. "But what you built in the dark, you built it to save lives. You made a wrong choice in the service of the right goal. And I have been doing this long enough to know that those two things don't cancel each other out. The wrong doesn't erase the service. The service doesn't excuse the wrong." Senna absorbed this. The bell struck. "What does that mean for us?" she asked. "It means we have a great deal of work ahead of us, and I would prefer to do it with you than without you." Vara's voice was even. "It also means that the next time you find a crack in an impossible problem, you come to me first. Whatever I'm managing, whatever else is burning, you come to me." Senna said yes. Just yes. No qualification, no negotiation. The old directness, the directness of someone who took a promise as seriously as a calculation. "The other thing," Vara said. "There's more. The night terror 3 weeks ago, you were the one who came. You sat with me in the dark and you held my hand, and you had known for 14 months and you still came." Vara stopped. She started again. "That was—" She stopped again. "I don't have a word for what that was." Senna said nothing for a while. The infirmary was quiet around them. Someone's breathing was slow and regular in sleep. "I was still myself," Senna said finally. "The thing I'd done didn't make me not myself. I was afraid of what you'd think of me when you found out, but I was still there." "Yes," Vara said, "I know." The result of the Keth's yield recalculation came at the end of the 5th week. Senna picked up the signal at the 3rd hour of the morning and came to Vara's room without knocking, which she had always done in emergencies, because the door was never truly locked between them. She stood at the foot of the bed with her small recording device in her hand and her hair loose around her shoulders, and her face doing the thing it did when she'd found a mechanism that worked bright and slightly unguarded, like a window someone had forgotten to close. "The fleet relay broadcast the reallocation order 6 minutes ago," she said. "The plateau is moved to held Q status. The Keth are pulling their processing resources to the southern continent." Vara sat up. She took the recording device. She read the data 3 times because she had long since learned not to trust the first reading of anything you desperately wanted to be true. It was true. She handed the device back. She sat on the edge of the bed with her feet on the stone floor and looked at the dark window. "How long does held Q status last?" she said. "Indefinitely, as long as the yield calculation stays unfavorable, which means we have to keep feeding the picture." Senna's voice was measured now, the engineering voice precise and honest. "It's not over. It's a different problem, but it's a survivable problem." "A survivable problem," Vara said. "Yes." She thought about 40,000 people in the Southern Valley who did not know they had just been given a year, and then another year, and then perhaps a string of years that added up to something called a future. She thought about Route 3, slowly becoming something real under the hands of an engineer who had learned deception the hard way and was using it now in the fortress's service. She thought about a boy named Tavrik who was 11 years old and did not know that his father had bought his life at a cost that Vara had decided she could absorb without it breaking anything essential. She thought about what it meant to lead people who were frightened, which was that they would do frightened things, and some of those things would be wrong, and some would be right, and some would be both. And the work of leadership was not to punish the fear out of them, but to channel it toward what needed to be built. She thought about hatred. She thought about it as an engineering problem, what it burned, what it cost, what it failed to produce. "Senna," she said. "Yes." "The heat signature design, the false road construction, the engagement calibration." She looked up at her. "The yield calculation. Nobody else could have built any of that." Senna said nothing. "I need you to know," Vara said, "that I know that." The silence that followed was not the silence of something unresolved. It was the silence of something that had been building for a long time finally arriving at its destination, setting down its weight and resting. In the morning, Vara called a full council. She told the captains about the reallocation in the precise and unembellished terms she always used for important things. She told them what held Q status meant and what maintaining it would require. She told them about Kren's son. She told them about Senna's 14 months, fully, without softening the part where Senna had gone to the Keth first or the part where it had worked. She told them about the second breach and how it had been resolved. She watched her captains' faces receive this information, and she did not look away from any of their expressions, including the ones that were angry and the ones that were struggling, and the ones that were something more complicated than either. Darrow said when she was finished, "We have a chance." "We have a chance," Vara agreed. "Because of her," he said, "not an accusation, an accounting." "Among other things." Vara looked around the table. "Because of every person in this room who has stayed and worked and not broken. Because of the people on the ridge 9 days ago. Because of a great many decisions made by a great many people under circumstances that made it very hard to decide well." She paused. "And yes, partly because of her." Pren said, "What happens to Engineer Senna now?" Vara said, "She goes back to work." In the afternoon, she walked to the eastern wall, the one where she had learned to throw a knife against the stone until the knife stopped trembling. The plateau spread below her in all its gray and complicated beauty, the black rock warming in the autumn sun, the far ridge still showing the scorch marks from 9 days ago. Somewhere below, in the valley, 40,000 people were going about the business of being alive without knowing how close the margin had been. Somewhere in the workshop, Senna was bent over a workbench, hands moving with that old sureness, building the next thing that needed building. The Keth were still out there. The fleet was still there, the ships the color of something the eye refused to hold. This was not over. The math said 8 months of sustained deception, minimum, and then a reassessment, and then more months, and then more decisions. It was the long work, the patient work, the kind that couldn't be won in a single engagement or resolved in a single night. Vara had never wanted the short work. She had never been built for the fast resolution, the clean ending, the story that concluded on the ridge with the enemy defeated and the people safe and nothing left to protect. She had been built for this, for the long hold, for the steady, undramatic, computational fact of continued existence in the face of everything that wanted to end it. She stood at the wall in the autumn sun and watched the plateau and felt the weight of it settle into its familiar place along her spine, the shape of 21 years of sovereignty, the knowledge that tomorrow there would be more decisions, more people who were frightened, more cracks in impossible problems that needed to be found by hands that never stopped moving. She thought about the Southern Valley, about what 40,000 people would do with the time they had been given. They would build things, probably. They would argue about water rights and trade agreements and the placement of watchtowers. They would have children who would grow up not knowing how close the margin had been, which was exactly as it should be. The children who grew up not knowing the margin were the point. They were the entire point. Every decision Vara had made for 21 years had been in service of a future in which the people on this plateau could go about the business of being alive without understanding the cost of that normalcy. Because understanding the cost was Vara's job, and the job of everyone who stood at walls and counted. She was not, she thought, a person who had ever wanted history to remember her well. History was for the children who didn't know the margin. She wanted the doing of it. She wanted the hard, specific problem, the thing that couldn't be fixed, the door that everyone else had decided was permanently closed. She wanted Senna's notebook full of calculations and the moment when a pattern resolved from noise. She was aware, as she stood at the wall, of a thing she had not allowed herself to feel during the 3 weeks between reading the transcript and the moment in the workshop when she had asked to see the heat signature design. Not anger. She had felt that fully in the private and unguarded hours, because anger was information and she had used every bit of it. But the thing beneath the anger, which was older and less useful as information, and which she therefore had disciplined away until the work was done. She had been afraid of losing her. Not as an asset, not as a strategic capability, though Senna was those things, and Vara had needed to think of her as those things to get through the work. But as the person who had been there every morning after the night terrors for 32 years, as the person whose hands never stopped moving, as the person who could not sleep until the broken thing was fixed and never had been able to, right from the beginning, right from the day Vara's father had pulled a child off a scaffold and handed her over like a gift and said, "I think she'll keep you out of trouble." She had not kept anyone out of trouble. She had instead kept everyone alive, which was considerably harder and considerably more important. And she had done it in ways that Vara had not always known about and had not always approved of, and had ultimately decided she could not do without. There was a word for that. Vara had been thinking about the word for 3 weeks. It was not friendship exactly, though it was that too. The way a building was more than its foundation and also entirely dependent on it. It was not loyalty in the military sense, the word that applied to Darrow and Pren and the captains. It was something older and less comfortable and more honest. It was the knowledge that there existed in the world a person who understood the specific shape of your mind, who had watched it work for 40 years, who knew its failures and its capabilities with the intimacy that only sustained proximity produces, and who had used that knowledge not to harm you, but to save the thing you were trying to save, even when the method was wrong. She was not going to say any of this tonight. She was going to let it sit for a while, the way you let certain materials cure before you put weight on them, but she was going to say it. She had decided that, standing at the wall. In the morning she walked back down from the eastern parapet to the fortress courtyard, where 3 of the lightly wounded from the engagement were sitting in the autumn sun doing the particular nothing of recovery, not healing exactly, just existing, letting the sun do what sun does to the cold that combat leaves in the body. They looked up when she came through the gate. She nodded to them. They nodded back. No ceremony, just the acknowledgement of shared ground. The courtyard stones were worn smooth by generations of boots. They caught the light like water. She walked through the fortress to the engineer's wing. The workshop door was open. Senna was at the central bench, bent over what appeared to be a new iteration of the thermal emitter, smaller this time, more portable, the design refined by the installation process in ways that the original spec hadn't accounted for. She was muttering to herself. This was normal. She had been muttering to herself in workshops for 40 years. She looked up when Vara came in. Her eyes went to Vara's face and read it the way she read everything, quickly, completely, with the full attention she gave to mechanisms. "You have something to say," she said. "I have several things to say," Vara said. "None of them are urgent." Senna set down her tool. She waited. Vara crossed the workshop to the stool beside the smaller workbench, the solder bench, the teaching bench, the bench that had been there since they were teenagers and had not moved in 40 years because neither of them had ever thought to move it. She sat on it. She put her elbows on her knees. "When I was 12, she said, "and you made me press my cut palm to your cut palm on the ridge at sunset, I thought it was the most serious thing that had ever happened to me." Senna said nothing. "I still think that," Vara said. "I think it is still the most serious promise I have ever made, and I think you were trying to keep it when you went to the Keth. In the wrong way, with the wrong method, without telling me. But you were trying to keep it." Senna's hands were very still on the workbench. "Whatever comes," Vara said, "that was what you said." "Yes," Senna said. "You decided it meant you would do whatever was necessary to protect this place, without asking me if that was what we meant by it." "Yes." "We're going to have to agree," Vara said, "on what we mean by it, going forward together, with all the words on the table." Senna was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "That sounds like a very difficult conversation." "The worst one we've ever had," I said. "You said," Senna's mouth moved into the thing that contained a smile, "and then we'll still be here, on the other side of it." "Yes," Vara said. "That's the idea." She reached out and put her hand briefly on the top of Senna's hand, not dramatically, not as a gesture of forgiveness, which would have required more ceremony than either of them was built for. Just the touch, the fact of it, 40 years of wait in 3 seconds. Then she took it back. "Show me the portable emitter design," she said. Senna turned the device on the bench. Her hands began to move again. They worked through the morning, the two of them, the way they had worked through 100 mornings before this one, and would work through 100 more. Outside the workshop window, the plateau spread in its complicated gray beauty under the autumn sky, the black granite of the iron hold catching the light the way it always had, the courtyard stones worn smooth by everyone who had ever walked them toward whatever the day required. Somewhere above the horizon, too high to see, the Keth's fleet held its position in the cold between the stars, running its calculations, updating its models, waiting for data that would tell it whether the cost of processing this particular patch of world was worth the yield. The data would say no. Senna's math would make it say no. And then, if they were careful and patient and thorough, the data would keep saying no month by month, as the fortress built the real thing behind the false picture. Real capacity, real consolidation, the slow accumulation of actual strength that might, given time, not require deception at all. That was the work. It was long and it was hard, and it did not come with guarantees, only with the steady, undramatic fact of continued effort by people who refused to stop. Vara had been built for it. She had always been built for it. She was not afraid. Or she was afraid because the fear was information, and she was using it. And that was the distinction that mattered.